Martin Scorsese masterfully portrays both the beauty and the ugliness of the criminal world. He often presents his stories in a detached manner, without judgment, allowing the viewer to decide for themselves which side to sympathize with, the good guys or the bad guys. We begin to understand these characters, their motivations, and how they arrived at their actions. All of this appears quite appealing at first, and it might seem that Scorsese romanticizes crime, that his plots are simple and lack profound moral lessons. But why does the director so often choose real stories or distorted prototypes of real people? It's not just a trendy gimmick where the label "based on real events" is supposed to make the film better. Scorsese uses real events because they make it easier to understand how personalities like Henry Hill, Frank Sheeran, or Jordan Belfort are formed. I'm convinced that Scorsese genuinely wants to understand this process. Not for the sake of saying this is a true story, but because he understands that criminals are not some distinct breed of people. They are us, ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. His films explore this very theme, focusing on real-life characters. It's an attempt to understand how someone becomes a Jordan Belfort, how a normal person transforms into a disgusting monster. And most importantly, in every one of Scorsese's films, it's about how one betrays oneself. Let's start by looking at how Jordan Belfort managed to make over $100 million. He explains this part directly, breaking the fourth wall and reminding us that everything, from wild parties to a sunken yacht, is completely true. Without referring to other sources, it might seem that Belfort's only crime was charging a 50% commission on cheap stocks. However, he hints that his main violation was securities manipulation. To avoid boring the viewers with a 3-hour-long story, Jordan calls his actions aggressive sales. But in reality, they were part of a fraudulent scheme called pump and dump. He would buy up stocks of a small company, causing them to become scarce and immediately rise in price. This was the pump phase. Then, he would sell those stocks to gullible clients at inflated prices, the dump phase. He repeated this cycle many times, earning money while investors lost theirs. Of course, brokers aren't allowed to trade stocks they own themselves, so formal holders of his stocks were frontmen. He taught his colleagues this scam, calling them Captain Ahabs, grotesquely chasing Moby Dick.
Every one of you to be Captain fucking Ahab. Get it? Huh?
Captain who?
Had Jordan finished the book, he would have learned that Captain Ahab drowned along with his ship after angering the white whale. The most significant scam for Jordan was the IPO, initial public offering, of Steve Madden's shoe company. He pumped so much money into it that it could have made him $1 billion, but he panicked about the FBI and sold his share for just $30 million. Jordan was a master of lying, just like everyone around him. He knew how to manipulate people, taking their money. Despite his position, he wasn't the biggest player on Wall Street, as he tells FBI agent Coleman. He learned this strategy from Mark Hanna, a senior broker at LF Rothschild. Even though Jordan worked there for just one day and happened to be there on Black Monday, that was enough for him to absorb the key idea. Jordan learned to bluff and use psychological pressure to gain the upper hand in any situation. One of his favorite tactics was to let the other person speak first. Whoever speaks first loses. All of this seems glamorous and attractive. Belfort, with his white-collar charm, charisma, and success, hides a much darker side of his character. He becomes a person who is essentially a scoundrel, selfish, unscrupulous, angry, and always hungry for more money. Deceiving people becomes so ingrained in his life that he doesn't even notice how far he's gone. He thought he could even buy off the most incorruptible federal agent, impressing him with yachts, bikinied women, and lobsters.
Hey, you guys want to take some lobsters for your ride home? Fucking miserable pricks.
But despite this, Scorsese doesn't impose a moral lesson on the viewer. The Wolf of Wall Street is unique in that Belfort doesn't just talk about his journey. He shares his feelings as he betrayed his own conscience. In an interview, he said that he never intended to become a bad guy. He never imagined that one day he would deceive people. But it didn't happen overnight. He didn't wake up one day and decide to get rich at any cost. He wanted to have it all, make money, and still stay true to himself. He thought that if he crossed the line just once, nothing would change, and he'd be able to go back and stay a good person. However, with each step, he pushed that line further away, and without realizing it, he became the self-centered, egotistical person he had gradually transformed into. This moment is the shift of the line. He crosses it and thinks nothing has changed. But the reality is that every time we do something wrong, we move that line, and it no longer seems so bad. Over time, people stop viewing their actions as wrong. Jordan emphasizes this point. The more he earned, the more he allowed himself, and he didn't notice how far he had drifted from the moral principles that once mattered to him. He thought the line was still in front of him, but in reality, it was long gone. This is what we often forget. When we make a deal with our conscience, we don't immediately realize how much we're deceiving ourselves. In his films, Scorsese neither condemns nor justifies his characters. He makes them real and human. He forces us to understand them, to step into their shoes so we can figure out why they acted the way they did. This is not romanticizing crime. It's capturing it, explaining it. The Wolf of Wall Street is less about morality and more about crossing a line. When you cross it, you're taking on a debt. You lie to people, justify your actions, and eventually, you don't notice how you've become what you once rejected. One day, you might wake up and realize that you've become someone else, a distorted shadow of your former self. This is not a warning that you'll end up in prison if you behave badly. It's a cautionary tale about the moment you wake up as a different person, and things won't turn out as you expected. In films like Goodfellas, The Irishman, The Wolf of Wall Street, and others, there is often a scene where the protagonist speaks directly to the audience, sharing their transformation into a monster and their downfall. We sympathize with these characters, follow them along their journey, and despite their vile actions, we still like them because we understand their motivations and remember who they once were. That's the key word. It's easy to trace how, in each film, the characters change their moral standards, distort concepts, and justify their actions and those of their loved ones. Their behavior might seem justified because, by slightly shifting the line of morality, any action can be made into a norm. Frank Sheeran's daughter doesn't understand him at first, then becomes afraid of him, then angry, and finally despises him. Frank starts by stealing, then moves on to killing, and in the end, murder becomes as routine for him as painting a house. Henry justifies himself by saying that the mafia is like a second police force for people who can't rely on the regular police. Henry's wife initially defends him, then is proud of him, and finally fears him.
I should fucking kill you!
In The Departed, we see the beginning of Colin's journey. He holds a grocery bag, and years later, he's holding the same kind of bag. It's the beginning and end of the path. The cost of making a deal with one's conscience and betraying oneself. At first, Jordan thinks his clients are idiots and blames them for losing money. He justifies his actions to himself and his wife, saying it's all perfectly legal.
Selling garbage to garbage men and making cash hand over fist. I knew how to spend it better.
Then, he devises more cunning and greedy ways of stealing money, which eventually become illegal, but that doesn't trouble him anymore.
The real question is this: was all this legal? Absolutely fucking not.
He becomes more and more deluded, just like we're deceived, following him, and he following himself. We don't notice how a person goes through a reverse transformation, from a human being to an ugly parasite. And in the end, all that glamour falls apart. Everyone dies, betrays one another, becomes an informant, wears wiretaps, and strikes deals with the authorities. There is no more nobility or beauty. There's only ugliness, as it is. The Wolf of Wall Street should not be seen as a biography of Jordan Belfort. It's a film about a man who succumbed to his inner vices and went down the wrong path. It's a film about temptation and the difficult journey leading to it.
I love you, buddy. You know I'd do it for you, right? I know. You know that, right? I know.
In the commentary, Scorsese says that his film isn't about fraudsters, and the characters shouldn't be seen as villains born to deceive and kill.
In actuality, I feel it's not someone else, it's us, it's you and me, and maybe if we had been born under different circumstances, we maybe would have wound up making exactly the same mistakes and choices and doing exactly the same things.
The Wolf of Wall Street is about what lies within each of us, about what we don't notice until we find ourselves in such a situation. Sometimes, only an external force can stop us. For Jordan, that force was an FBI agent and a 22-month prison sentence. At the very end of the film, we see the real Jordan presenting himself in the film portrayal, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. He gives a lecture on the art of persuasion and the skills of a great salesman, and people hang on to every word he says. That's the quality that allowed him to survive all his adventures and come out alive. Despite selling his assets and being ordered to pay $100 million to the victims of his schemes, he admits that he is now happier than ever. No one is watching him anymore. He has nothing to hide, and a bright future awaits him. He's made millions again, honestly, without deals with his conscience, preserving what little pride he has left. Jordan and Agent Coleman eventually became friends, even recording a podcast where Jordan admits he could have made much more money if he had acted legally from the start. Scorsese's films don't impose cheap morality on us and don't throw phrases. He simply shows how, in certain situations, something can become the norm. Norm is an abstract concept that changes depending on time and circumstances. A person doesn't change themselves. They adapt. Who knows? In the situation Jordan found himself in, we might have acted the same way.